BBC has been dragged now into apologizing to President Trump a little at a time, kicking and screaming, clearly most reluctantly, after it was, well, caught cheating, manipulating a speech by Trump at the time of the January 6th rioting in Washington back in 2021. BBC chairman Sameer Shah at first described the distortion as an error of judgment.
The apologizing is for the way the team edited President Trump's speech to his supporters on January the 6th.
But was it just that? Could it have been just that? Consider two sentences spoken almost an hour apart, joined together as one to falsely get Trump to appear to be calling for violence immediately. Did one of these sentences just jump out accidentally to join the other? Not what a lot of people are prepared to believe, including a number of members of parliament.
I don't think any reasonable person can think that the programme put out by Panorama was a mistake. It was clearly manipulation with a purpose.
The purpose would seem clear. The report was broadcast in October last year, a week before the US elections.
The BBC has said that the editing of the Panorama programme gave the impression of a direct call for violent action, something that they then described as an error of judgment, which seems an extraordinary understatement.
And just how were the two sentences joined? This, for a start, is what Trump said.
We're going to walk down to the Capitol and we're going to cheer on our brave senators and congressmen and women.
In the BBC edit, as it was called, he was then made to say, we're going to walk down to the Capitol, yes, and then the sentence was completed, so to speak, to say, I'll be there with you and we fight like hell. The BBC, understandably, is in no mood to share footage of that edit, supposedly, and if just edit it was, of course, and that's from a news organization that does not tire of advertising itself as the bearer of the gold standard in journalism.
They actually changed my January 6th speech, which was a beautiful speech, which was a very calming speech, and they made it sound radical. And they actually changed it. What they did was rather incredible. They're showing me the results later on, the results of what they did, how they butchered it up.
And this long, BBC did not find anything wrong with what it had done. In May of this year, a BBC ethics advisor pointed this out among a number of other problem broadcasts to bosses in a 19-page dossier. The bosses then did nothing still. They just sat on the dossier until the Telegraph newspaper broke this story based on a leak, leading then to a couple of resignations now at the very top. And all this came only after public exposure of the manipulation. What BBC did and then the way it responded has now led to sharp questions whether this was just one freak case, one freak incident, or whether the BBC is systemically biased in at least a good deal of its broadcasting. That would then make this very much more than some isolated error of judgment as claimed, and demands are rising now for institutional correction. The government has defended the BBC as it would. The BBC, after all, is public tax funded, and much of that funding is routed through the Foreign Office, particularly for programming with sensitive foreign policy overtones in sensitive areas, and surely that speaks for itself.
I'm pleased that the chairman of the BBC, Dr. Sameer Shah, has accepted where the institution has made mistakes, but I would gently push back against the assertion that this should affect our support for the World Service. The World Service is a light on the hill for people in places of darkness, and there are many in the world at the moment, and this government strongly supports the World Service and will continue to do so.
The BBC is publicly funded, but not quite publicly answerable, even though BBC has some sort of a complaints procedure in place, and at the moment, as it stands, it just plays judge and jury in dealing with complaints made to it about itself.
And should not, as a first step, the Editorial Guidelines and Standards Committee be made far tougher and fully independent, and will she consider this and other measures as part of the charter review that she is undertaking as a way of strengthening the impartiality requirement that was inserted in the last charter review.
Over a recent 5-year period, BBC received 1.7 million complaints, about 4 in 10 of them about biased coverage. And BBC is not exactly transparent in disclosing all that these complaints were about. And over those 5 years, it held just 25 of these to have some sort of validity. On average, 5 in a year. So BBC, inquiring into complaints about itself, found only 1 in 68,000 such complaints to have any validity at all.
Too many examples have come to light exposing bias at the BBC, particularly as it relates to the news and current affairs output. Examples that have often strayed far away from the BBC's own editorial guidelines.
Just currently, the BBC Arabic service has been found to have used the son of a Hamas official as narrator, and the Arabic service did not report the plight of Israeli hostages at all. At a recent festival in Glastonbury, anti-Semitic chants were allowed to be live streamed at length before the broadcast of these chants was finally stopped. And these are only some of the current complaints that are publicly known. It isn't that there is nothing to complain about and that people are not complaining. The difficulty is that they are not being heard by the BBC. That really sits behind a wall, behind these walls. The BBC fails at present to acknowledge almost all of these complaints, let alone correct them, and never mind correcting itself. This time BBC is under fire because it messed with Trump, of all people. And Trump has now demanded a full and fair retraction of the documentary and any other defamatory statements in as conspicuous a manner as they were originally published, and this is in a notice to the BBC. The White House certainly is not shy of letting it be known where it stands.
The president was deeply concerned by the editing, the purposeful and dishonest editing of his speech that was so clearly fake news, and he rightfully dubbed that term many years ago, and this is a classic example of that. We see it in the United States all the time. We see it now in the United Kingdom. As you know, the president's external legal counsel has filed a lawsuit against the BBC. We expect that to continue.
In response to that lawsuit threat, BBC published a formal apology but has refused to offer compensation. The dragged out BBC apologies appear to be now more strategic than honest. An apology underlined now by a couple of top resignations would, one would think, take some of the steam out of Trump's legal move, and admitting to an error and no more could potentially save BBC from allegations of malice that are fundamental to winning a defamation suit in the US. And then the admission by the BBC chair later that BBC should have acted earlier was no doubt intended further to diffuse the situation and weaken that case against the BBC. Late on Friday evening, Trump told reporters on board Air Force One that he still intends to sue BBC despite its apology. He said he would sue probably next week, and not for just $1 billion, but for up to $5 billion. Trump said he would speak with Prime Minister Starmer about this over the weekend. Whichever way this finally goes, getting caught cheating has taken much of the shine off that self-projected image of the gold standard in journalism that BBC has sworn by. And this is not counting all the perceived wrongs that may not yet have come to light, like the 68,000 or so -1.
Fighting so long and so hard that they don't know what the they're doing.